I guess I'll introduce our speaker today, who is Stephen C. Kepher. He received his bachelor's in international relations from USC, and then a Master of Literature with distinction in war studies at University of Glasgow. 2007, obviously in Scotland. Actually, I have a friend who studied there also. More notably, after going through ROTC, joined the U.S. Marine Corps, and for 5 years, he was a bombardier navigator on A6 Intruder. He retired with the rank of captain, and then worked as an account manager, working for nonprofits, again before entering, I guess, the area of military history. Today he's going to talk to us about his book, COSSAC, Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Morgan and the Genesis of Operation Overlord, which was published back in 2017 by Naval Institute Press, of course, very reputable military history publisher. And according to the bio I see here, he's living in France, again, a country, of course, I love very much. But I guess with that, we'll leave it to Mr. Kepher to give us his presentation and lecture on COSSAC.
Thanks, Alex. Actually, it was published in 2020, but other than that, thank you so much. As you say, COSSAC, Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Morgan, and the genesis of Operation Overlord. The story of COSSAC and the planning for a cross-channel assault is the story of coalition warfare, high-level politics, and the debate about the right strategy for fighting and winning a war as it was occurring. It involved the creation of a multinational staff without a commander, planning the most important operation in the main theater of the war before that operation had even been approved, and with a force assigned that was barely adequate to accomplish the mission. To launch the operation, an amphibious assault would be conducted, and a largely unproven and highly risky exercise at the time, and the doctrine for which had yet to be fully worked out, and the specialized equipment and the quantities thought to be needed to be successful just starting to reach operational theaters. During this period, only one of the coalition partners had an operational headquarters participating in the planning, and many senior officers and politicians continued to have doubts both about the timing of the assault or whether it even could be successful. Over the 9 months of its existence, COSSAC, which is an acronym for Chief of Staff Supreme Allied Commander, applied both to the position held by Lieutenant General Morgan and to the planning staff. They continually expanded as new subject areas emerged as a result of the planner's detailed approach to their job. Its initial structure was radically modified, personal turnover was frequent, and the most common approach to problem solving was trial and error. They also developed a habit of reinterpreting or ignoring direction from the chiefs of staff when better choices were available. They decided where the proposed invasion would take place, settling a debate that had raged for over a year. They had found a solution to what was up to then an impossible problem, how to build up and supply elements of 2 army groups without port facilities. And their outline plan covered both the initial assault phase and the first 90 days of the campaign. In addition to the outline plan for the assault, COSSAC developed a contingency plan to move troops across the channel quickly in case there was a much hoped for collapse of German resistance. While that collapse obviously didn't occur, planning for it forced them to consider civil relations and military government, which they designed to function more efficiently than the structure used in Italy. The same contingency plan required them to consider post-war occupation of Germany, treatment of displaced persons, repatriation of POWs, and the establishment of creditable, functional, and secure relations with governments in exile. Unlike in other theaters of operation, the countries the armies would be passing through on their way to Germany would not be occupied. They'd be liberated and with their own national governments installed or reinstalled. In Germany, a whole new civic order would have to be established, as would the various sectors of military occupation for the former Reich. Reflecting these issues, COSSAC added a section that would have routine contact with the governments in exile and added representation from the British Foreign Office and the US State Department to the staff. COSSAC had a third major task, the planning and execution of a diversion in September of 1943 in the hope that a major air battle would occur on terms favorable to the Allies. While an unquestioned failure on its own terms, it helped lay the groundwork for the successful deception campaign known as Bodyguard, with its Fortitude North and South components. And you see here, just to bring us along off the title slide, there's basically Western Europe. And then we zoom in a little to the area of most interest. And then we start looking across the channel. Despite agreements at 3 summit conferences, one coalition partner continued to advocate for additional offensive action in the secondary theater, which would have had the practical effect of delaying the assault past the end of 1944's invasion season in the English Channel. It took Stalin to make sure the Cossacks' work would be of use to the Western Allies. And so now we're going to look at 2 less well-known milestones on the way to Overlord. The first, a proposal that informed much of Cossacks' work. The second, a conference that made it possible for COSSAC to write the outline plan and meet the deadlines for the combined chiefs of staff. Dunkirk changed everything. After they had been kicked off the continent, the British knew they were only 2 ways back. First, kicking in the door, re-entering the continent was beyond their capacity. The other alternative was what I call a picador strategy, tightening the ring around Germany, bombing German cities, encouraging partisan groups, and from June of 1941, keeping the Soviet Union in the war. If they could continue to stretch German forces, inflict local defeats wherever possible, gain control of North Africa, take Italy out of the war, bring Turkey into the war, then the combination of the bombing campaign and hopeful Russian victories would lead to a German collapse similar to what happened at the end of the Great War of 1914-18. This was the strategy they presented at the Arcadia Conference in Washington, D.C. in December of 41, and it remained the British approach without much modification through up to early 1944. The Americans, lacking a trained army in 1942, nevertheless wanted to find a way to take the fight to Germany. They proposed 3 operations, or 3 components. The first, Bolero, the buildup of troops and supplies in Great Britain for a cross-channel attack. This was readily accepted by the British, who realized the American troops could serve a variety of purposes, either offensive or defensive. Sledgehammer was conceived as an emergency operation designed to relieve the pressure on the Russian front if the Soviets were on the brink of defeat. It was meant to be a desperate sacrificial throw, was never creditable, at least in my opinion, and the British, who would have had to provide most of the troops, aircraft, and ships, rejected it in short order. Roundup, the third component, was to be the cross-channel attack in 1943. The British did not reject the operation, but kept the focus on the Mediterranean. It was because of Bolero and Roundup that a U.S. Army Theater Command, ETO USA, or ETUSA, was established in England in 1942. Ray Barker arrived in London in the spring of 42. Then Colonel Barker was a field artillery officer who had commanded 2 artillery regiments before being assigned to ETUSA. When he arrived in London, he was appointed the operations officer because, as he explained, quote, "I happened to be standing there and no one else was available," unquote. While building his own staff, Barker worked in close cooperation with the British planners and got to know the people at most of the ministries. In a post-war interview, he was asked if he had been assigned to work with the British. Barker replied, "No one actually told me I should associate myself with those people. It was just the obvious thing to do." The C&C of Home Forces, General Sir Bernard Paget, the Air Officer Commanding Fighter Command, Air Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, and Commander-in-Chief Portsmouth, Admiral Sir Charles Little, were known as the Combined Commanders. They were tasked with planning for a return to the continent when, quote, "German morale and strength have deteriorated to a degree that will permit us to establish forces on the continent." The combined operations was to be consulted in this planning, and it was the planners in those organizations with whom Barker associated. The overall context in the summer of 1942 can be seen in a memorandum by the combined chiefs of staff that noted that as a result of Torch, the Anglo-American invasion of Morocco and Algeria, we have accepted a defensive encircling line of action for the European theater, but the organization, planning, and training for eventual entry into the continent should continue in case there was a marked deterioration in German strength, and that the resources of the United Nations available after meeting other commitments so permit. That meant planning for Roundup was to be based on working out the minimum requirements for a landing against weakening opposition, and was unlikely to occur in 1943. By the end of September 42, the planners for the combined commanders and now Brigadier General Barker and the ETUSA planners We're working on the 6th draft of a proposal titled Future Planning for Operation Roundup, and the 3rd draft of a similar memo, Offensive Combined Operations in Northwest Europe, 1943-44. Their work was starting to seem pointless. This led Barker and Major General Sir John Sinbad Sinclair to agree on New Year's Day 43 that enough information had been generated to create a plan that would bring it all to a head and come up with a definite conclusion and a definite recommendation. What they, on their own initiative, produced was Operation Skyscraper, submitted to the combined commanders in March of 43. The first sentence of the document read, "The object of this paper is to obtain decisions on certain major points which must govern not only the planning for a return to the continent against opposition, but more particularly the organization, equipment, and training of the Army in the United Kingdom during 1943, which of course had to start if you were going to be successful in 1944. Sinclair and Barker asserted that the original Roundup plan was not feasible and some other basis for planning was necessary. Unlike earlier proposals, Skyscraper attempted to determine what would be necessary to overcome determined resistance from an enemy that was not demoralized. Changing the concept from a series of landings on the Pas-de-Calais, they proposed concentrating on the beaches in front of Caen and Normandy, as well as on the Cherbourg Peninsula. Hopefully you can see those. They estimated that the force necessary would include 10 divisions of the initial assault, up to 4 or 5 airborne divisions, plus commandos, engineers, and other special troops. While this scenario involved 3 distinct phases up to the capture of Antwerp, the key messages to the combined commanders and chiefs of staff were at the end of the summary. While acknowledging that what they called the bill in terms of troops and resources was a large one, they made it clear that in their estimate, that this was the minimum resources likely to promise success against appreciable resistance. And as it says on the slide, they had the emphasis in the original, as all caps in their document. The margin between success and failure would be very narrow. Even more remarkable was the passage at the end of the summary where Barker and Sinclair demand the chiefs of staff make an unequivocal choice. An invasion of the continent in face of German opposition is such a specialized problem that there is no chance of undertaking it successfully without careful preparation over a long period. So they're asking, for what are we to plan and prepare? If we are to plan and prepare to invade, then we have to know the resources are going to be given to us. If not, we have to accept that we can't contemplate a landing against opposition. To defer the decision is to decide not to be ready. General Paget sent the plan to the chiefs of staff, who did not respond directly. The chiefs did remark that they felt some of the assumptions regarding the scale of German resistance were vague. And at that point, the document was filed for the time being. So in the summer of 1939, Frederick Morgan was promoted to brigadier and given command of the just being formed support group of the 1st Armored Division, a brigade-sized unit of infantry, artillery, and engineers. It was with this unit that he deployed to France in May of 1940. During the battle for France, he was ordered to take his unit from Abbeville, which you can find somewhere near Amiens, I think, just above Amiens, near the coast. Fight through German lines and reach Dunkirk so that he could be evacuated. He dismissed the order as nonsensical, led his troops first to Cherbourg and then to Brest, where his unit and 1,500 Canadians he picked up along the way were evacuated on 18 June as part of Operation Ariel. Back in England, preparing for a German invasion and promoted to Major General, he took charge of the defense of the counties of Devon and Cornwall. His collection of, quote, more or less armed men, as he described his mix of Home Guard and regular army units, were titled, unsurprisingly, the Devon and Cornwall Division. From there, he was transferred to Yorkshire and the command of the 55th Division. In early 1942, he was promoted to the temporary rank of Lieutenant General and given command of 1st Corps, also located in Yorkshire. As preparations for Torch accelerated, 1st Corps was assigned to the operation, and in late October of 42, Morgan traveled to London to meet Eisenhower at Allied Force Headquarters, located in Norfolk House on St. James's Square. Morgan was given the assignment of planning an amphibious landing in Spanish Morocco opposite Gibraltar in case the Germans drove into Spain and attempted to close the straits. When that threat did not materialize, he was tasked with planning an invasion of Sardinia. A short time later, his assignment was changed again to planning an invasion of Sicily. He quickly saw that an invasion of Sicily was beyond what a reinforced corps would be able to accomplish, and the planning was handed over to those who would command the operation. Morgan's 2 divisions became replacement units and were fed into the North African campaign. He was told that First Corps would be reconstituted and would begin training for the eventual re-entry into the continent. The benefits of his relatively short period with Allied Force headquarters were his firsthand experience in seeing a functional Anglo-American headquarters, his appreciation for Eisenhower, a growing friendship with Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Walter Beadle Smith, as well as his demonstrated ability to work well with Britain's American allies and the experience he gained in planning amphibious operations. When considering the implications of his new assignment, Morgan's experience and his common sense prompted him to write to his old friend from service in India, Lord Hastings, nicknamed Pug Ismay, now Churchill's military advisor, to point out some of the weaknesses in the current situation. Morgan pressed higher authorities to be more specific. Where are we going to attack, when, and with what? He knew that there needed to be some correlation between where troops are trained for amphibious assaults and the beaches that they're actually going to attack. He gave Ismay his strong opinion that someone should be appointed who would do something about this lack of direction. Ismay knew that a decision had been made at the Casablanca conference in January to appoint someone to form a planning staff to look at those issues. He invited Morgan to write a paper on the subject and also invited him down to London to discuss the matter. Once in Ismay's office, Morgan was handed a stack of documents and papers representing the work done by various people at various times on the general theme of a cross-channel assault. A key paper he was given was Operation Skyscraper. Morgan was asked to review the material and make a presentation to the chiefs of staff the next day. Morgan duly submitted a memorandum, but he did not think much of his first attempt, quote, nor did the chiefs of staff, unquote. So he was given a second chance, which was witnessed by Ismay and by Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, as well as by the British chiefs of staff. A few days later, Morgan crossed paths with Mountbatten at the latter's headquarters at New Scotland Yard, where Morgan was attending a meeting. Sharing an elevator, Mountbatten enthusiastically congratulated Morgan on his new position, which was the first hint Morgan had of his fate. While he received official confirmation of his appointment as COSSAC in late March, his orders with the specifics of his tasks to be accomplished were not provided until late April, the result of a debate between the American and British chiefs as to precise wording. Morgan made the following points in his presentation to the chiefs of staff. It's not just another planning exercise. We have to accept that this campaign has already begun. It needed to be joint and combined from the start, joint and combined, more than one nation, more than one service from both nations. And it had to be an allied staff not functioning along national lines. It should be formed as the embryo of the Supreme Commander's operational staff, which meant it needed to be slotted into the existing chain of command, but independent enough to seamlessly become the Supreme Headquarters when the time came. If there was to be no Supreme Commander, then all of the commander would need must be provided for: forces, a supply system, command and control systems, effective working relationships with all the relevant ministries and commands, and most importantly, a plan of action, as he said, so basically sound and yet sufficiently elastic to admit of variation as might be necessitated by developing circumstances. Or in other words, good enough to be approved, but capable of being modified. Implicit in his presentation was the working assumption that once the outline plan was approved, a Supreme Allied Commander would be appointed. One compelling reason for this was that Morgan did not have executive authority. The British Army in 1943 did not give staff officers like Morgan by direction authority, particularly when there was no one from whom Morgan could receive the direction. His final orders, or his orders as received in April 43 from the Combined Chiefs of Staff, shown here, required him to prepare 3 plans. The diversionary attack, including at least one amphibious feint, which would require ships, troops, and aircraft. A rapid response when and if the Germans collapsed, and a full-scale assault as soon as practical or possible in 1944. Morgan asked for clarification regarding the last point, feeling that as early as possible was not particularly precise from a planning standpoint. His question resulted in a discussion of the cross-channel attacks being added to the agenda of the next summit conference, Trident, which was held in Washington, D.C. in May of 43. The answer he received after the conference ended was a date of 1 May 44, and Morgan could finally begin to plan the assault. The combined chiefs also estimated that 29 divisions would be available for the initial phase. Working with the estimate of landing craft likely to be available, this worked out to an initial assault of 3 divisions, with 2 more as immediate follow-up, plus 2 airborne divisions, but with only enough lift to deploy 2/3 of 1 division at a time. The chiefs also noted that the plans for the cross-channel assault and the return in case of German collapse would be considered at the next summit quadrant in Quebec in mid-August. This meant that those plans had to be at the combined chiefs by 1 August to give them time to review the proposals. Following from that, the due date to the British chiefs would be 15 July. While Morgan reported to the combined chiefs, he did so through the British chiefs, his immediate superiors, which gave them a right of first veto on any proposal. So he had 10 weeks to complete both plans and to begin planning Operation Starkey, which was the feint in September. Rankin was the contingency plan for the collapse of German collapse. And of course, Overlord, that was due mid-July as well. Morgan wasn't idle while waiting for formal orders. He started recruiting senior planners, anticipating that they in turn would recruit additional staff. He acquired office space in Norfolk House, which still exists, and convinced some of the agencies located there to provide COSSAC with clerical support for the time being. He also started the process of contacting ministries and notifying other commands. His time in the War Office before the war proved helpful, as he knew or knew of most of the officers who would be both available and desirable, while his long service in India made it easier to reach out to fellow Indian Army veterans who knew each other. His friendship with Canadian General Andrew McNaughton, dating from service with the Canadian Corps at the end of the Great War, resulted in a contingent of Canadian Army staff officers being available, as were staff officers from South Africa and other dominions. Representatives from other services of both nations, particularly the US contingent, arrived more slowly and suffered from high turnover rates for a variety of reasons. One senior British planner noted in a post-war interview that the American Air Force and Navy came very little into the planning picture. They changed frequently and had little continuity in their work. There were at least 2 reasons for this. First, as Morgan observed, while senior British officers were notably less enthusiastic about the project than their American counterparts, it was the opposite among the more junior officers. The British tended to sign on at once, while some Americans didn't see the point in associating with what looked like a predominantly British staff for an operation that could become a dead end or never happen. The second reason was that COSSAC never had in what US parlance is called a G1, or an administrative section. Everyone was on temporary additional duty from other organizations until Eisenhower's headquarters was established in 44. Additionally, not everyone could adapt to working in a multinational environment. Consequently, some returned to their home commands earlier than anticipated. General Alan Brooke, chair of the British Chiefs of Staff, had discussed American staffing with COSSAC with the Atoosa commander, Lieutenant General Andrews, on 26 March. This led to Major General Barker being appointed as Deputy Chief of Staff for COSSAC, or as he was called, Deputy COSSAC. And here, just informationally, is a org chart that shows the combined chiefs of staff and how the flow would go from them to a supreme commander, to the chiefs of staff, or in this case, chief of staff, singular, to the combined staff, and then down to the Commander-in-Chief Allied Naval Expeditionary Force, the U.S. Army Group Commander, British Army Group Commander, Commander-in-Chief Allied Expeditionary Air Force. None of that existed when Morgan was appointed. He was the chief of staff. There was no one above him in between. There was no deputy supreme commander, no supreme commander. So that's one reason why the British chiefs of staff were his immediate reporting senior. There was no Commander-in-Chief Allied Naval Expeditionary Force. CNC Portsmouth stood in for him. There was no U.S. Army Group Commander. British Army Group Commander, 21st Army Group was just being established with Paget, and Lee Mallory at Fighter Command was standing in as commander of the Allied Expeditionary Air Force. The initial organization for COSSAC, and this is a horrible slide, I apologize, it's out of a book. What he had was an American section and a British section running in parallel for intelligence, operations, and what he calls administration. And what he calls administration, we would say is logistics or supply. And so you would have a British officer and a US officer, each in charge of their own section within each of those components. Later, that evolved to a more simplified American model as it became clear that the Supreme Allied Commander was likely to be an American. And as Barker pointed out, and as you can tell from the charts previous, we didn't start out with any table of organization. There was a certain amount of trial and error. Morgan admitted that without Skyscraper, it would have been impossible to cover all the ground needed to prepare the COSSAC plans in the limited time they had available. It was the key paper among those he had been given to read by Ismay. It was clear from Morgan from reading Skyscraper that planners had serious morale problems. Tasked with performing iteration after iteration of the same plan without measurable progress was having a serious negative effect. Commodore John Hughes Hallett, who was Admiral Little's representative at COSSAC for the crucial planning period, evaluated the naval planners he encountered there. They had ceased to believe in the reality of their work. It should be said that Barker considered Hughes Hallett excellent, combat experienced, and intensely practical. Another COSSAC planner described him as obstinate and determined, an exceedingly capable man who succeeded in getting everybody's back up. Morgan addressed the serious morale problem head on in his first address to the COSSAC staff. One can get a sense of Morgan's approach in his speech. While we have to produce a plan, we're not a planning staff. We must somehow produce action. Morgan then reiterated that they were not a planning staff, but the beginning of an operational staff serving as the vanguard for a powerful army being gathered in the United States, which would join with British, Canadian, and American forces already in Britain. Their mission was not another raid or just across the channel. They were there to, quote, plan nothing less than the reconquest of Europe. He made it clear that while the initial challenge was to get across the channel, their goal was Berlin. As a reminder of the scope of the task in front of him, Morgan announced that the map in his office would not be the routine view of the English coast facing northern France, but one that featured San Francisco to the west and Berlin to the east. He finished his remarks by showing everyone a draft organizational outline so each person could see exactly where they fit in. He let them know that regarding both the creation of the plans and his obligation to keep his superiors informed as to their progress, quote, I rely entirely upon you. The two senior COSSACs spent a great deal of time working with the planners on the next lower level, quote, giving them our ideas, checking on what they were doing. They often worked late into the night, either working on a specific problem or, quote, just having a bull session on seeing on how things seem to be going, trying to seize up the situation. As Barker said, the whole process was quite informal. Among all the other challenges were two fundamental questions. The first, could it be done? And that included in that was where would it occur? The second, which agency or staff was really responsible for creating the plan? Paget, now the commander of the newly formed 21st Army Group, doubted that a cross-channel assault could be conducted successfully with the forces available. And he believed if it must attempted, the Pas-de-Calais was the correct choice. 21st Army Group was the command responsible for both training the British troops for the operation and for conducting the assault when the time came. That meant that Paget would be the operations commander, or so it was believed in the spring of '43. Consequently, his views had considerable weight. However, as we've seen, COSSAC was an allied staff, which reported to the combined chiefs of staff and not to 21st Army Group. General Brooke and the British chiefs also believed that Pas-de-Calais was the correct choice, particularly if German opposition was weakening. The ability to provide air cover was better. It was the shortest distance. The waters and currents were less challenging than those around Normandy. Any plan Morgan submitted would be reviewed and approved by the British chiefs first. Mountbatten felt that Normandy was the correct choice. The shelter from the unpredictable Channel weather was better. The German defenses were not as strong because everybody expected the attack at Pas-de-Calais. The port of Cherbourg, along with Le Havre, had more capacity than ports farther east until one got to Antwerp. Once ashore, the terrain was better for the creation of a lodgment, and fighter cover could be provided. Combined operations was considered the repository of all knowledge relating to amphibious operations conducted from Britain. And given Mountbatten's status as both a recently appointed member of the Chiefs of Staff and as a member of the royal family, this position had to be considered. One step Morgan took was to have some RAF charts, not those, pasted together to lay out a view of Western Europe as it might be seen from Berlin. This helped him see the problem through enemy eyes and to understand the challenges they faced in preparing to defend against invasion. As an attempt to resolve the debate, the U.S. Army planners at COSSAC were directed to make the case for Normandy, while the British argued the case for Calais. The presentations were reviewed by Morgan, Barker, Paget, Lieutenant General Jacob Devers, who had replaced Andrews at Etoussa after Andrews died in a plane crash, and Mountbatten. The argument was long and passionate, but resolved nothing. Paget still felt Pas-de-Calais was correct. Mountbatten and the Americans still believed in Normandy. Morgan hesitated to decide. It may have been because of Paget's seniority, or perhaps Morgan was sensitive about his position as a staff officer and Paget's as a commander. He was certainly aware that he would have to continue working with both Paget and Mountbatten, as well as being keen to protect the rights and prerogatives of his unnamed commander. Morgan was also aware that COSSAC did not have a sympathetic ear of the Chiefs of Staff. As he later wrote, quote, whenever one was forced to refer to the Chiefs of Staff, there always seemed to be an air of thinly disguised impatience with the upstart amateurs from over the way, unquote. It was not clear who was ultimately responsible for the plan to the combined chiefs. COSSAC planners routinely consulted planners at 21st Army Group and combined operations. There wasn't time to rely on formal channels of communication. All the relevant planning staffs were kept up to date and gave their opinions, if for no other reason than to prevent surprises and misunderstandings. This muddied the waters somewhat when it came to understanding where the final responsibility lay. Morgan agreed with Mountbatten and most of the planners that Normandy was the correct choice. However, the exact relationship between COSSAC and combined operations wasn't clear either. Was combined operations to serve as the expert advisors or as supervisors and instructors? The clock obviously was running. It was late May when Morgan's questions about the cross-channel attack were answered. In early June, he was still seeking a broader consensus, and the plan was due to the chiefs on 15 July. And at this point, there was no attempt to create a detailed operational plan. As Barker advised Morgan on 18 June, it should be an outline of what we considered to be possible. And it's only a proposal until it's been approved. And nothing can be done until it does get approved. Time presses. So all of these factors were threatening the whole enterprise. And with the support of Mountbatten, the conflicts were resolved at the Rattle Conference on board the not particularly seaworthy HMS Warren at the end of June and early July 43. How Rattle came about depends on who tells the story. According to Mountbatten, Freddie Morgan did absolutely nothing when he arrived. That is why, in desperation, I called the large conference, Rattle, to try and get something done. I tried to persuade Freddie to call the conference. He simply said he wasn't the supreme commander, that he was only the supreme commander's chief of staff, and that he couldn't ask all the other commanders in chief who were superior to him. I then said, well, in that case, I'll call it myself. While Mountbatten's impatience was understandable, it was unfair to say that Morgan had done nothing. Furthermore, Morgan was highly sensitive to the absence of a supreme commander, perhaps excessively so, and was still feeling his way around in a new position. It would have been a greater risk to err in the other direction and chance offending those whose will and cooperation he needed. Morgan was in a situation where he had to be a diplomat as well as a soldier. Additionally, it would not have been helpful for him to call a meeting and have senior commanders decide not to attend. Mountbatten, who simultaneously held the rank of vice admiral, lieutenant general, and air marshal, who was a confidant of the prime minister and a member of the royal family, had a different perspective and didn't face Morgan's challenges. His involvement cut the Gordian knot that Morgan wrestled with. The two were very much in league with each other in making Rattle a success. For his part, Morgan believed that the chief of combined operations didn't get the full credit he deserved for his participation in the early planning stages. Hughes Howat remembered that Mountbatten wrote Morgan early in June, suggesting that combined operations headquarters put on a course for the benefit of, quote, senior staff, officers, and junior commanders who would be taking part in the invasion. He offered to host the course at HMS Warren, formerly known as the Hollywood Hotel in Largs, Scotland, which was a combined training center and was in the business of providing combined operations courses for selected officers of all services. On 9 June 43, Mountbatten invited Paget, Lee Mallory, Morgan, and Hughes Howat to combined operations headquarters to discuss the idea and to work out some details. Hughes Howat recalled that Paget was furious at the idea and at first refused to attend. Finally persuaded by Lee Mallory, Paget gave the air marshal and Hughes Howat a ride in his car. While Paget continued to denounce the idea along the way, Lee Mallory argued that much good could come from such a meeting, and perhaps it should be attended by the combined commanders as well as their most senior staff officers. Hughes Howat offered that it could be called a conference, not a course, and it could consist of a series of short lectures and presentations with discussions by experts dealing sequentially with all the issues relating to the assault. The three sat in Paget's car debating while parked in front of New Scotland Yard, making them late for the meeting. Finally, Paget reluctantly agreed. In Mountbatten's office, the suggested modifications were quickly accepted. Morgan and Mountbatten worked out the agenda and conference details. The idea of a study period was presented to the chiefs of staff on 11 June with General Devers in the room. Devers asked if he and his staff could attend, and they were welcomed immediately. The final agenda was issued by COSSAC on 22 June. As Morgan wrote, Rattle was the opportunity to gather everyone in one place and insist all points of views be talked through. Quote, the object was to give all concerned the opportunity to discuss openly with each other the whole subject of a cross-channel operation, its feasibility in general, and the practicality of all the many detailed points of execution. We must hear the conclusion of the whole matter argued out in public. There was, as he said, to be no sulking in one's tent. It was also essential for Morgan to make clear that COSSAC was now charged with the responsibility for developing the plan. The first session started at 10 a.m. on Monday, the 28th of June. Mountbatten served as chair. There were more than 70 attendees, including the combined commanders, representatives from the Admiralty, the War Office, the Air Ministry, RAF Air Groups, 21st Army Group, 2nd British Army, 1st Canadian Army, 1st Corps of the British Army, 6th Airborne Division of the British Army, Fighter Command, ITUSA, Combined Operations Headquarters, and COSSAC. Many of those present would go on to have operational commands on D-Day. According to one participant, there were 20 assorted generals, 11 air marshals and air commodores, 8 admirals, and brigadiers galore. The agenda was detailed in a chronological order. It started with the assembly and embarkation of troops, the cross-channel voyage, the beach assault, including the use and timing of naval gunfire support, the consequent buildup of forces, the use of airborne forces and signals. There were visits to a headquarters ship and landing craft. There was a discussion of the scope and location of combined training for both British and American troops, control of tactical aircraft, recognition of air forces, uses of air transport, the need for working ports, and supply over the beach. There were a variety of other issues as well. Mountbatten's reports to the British chiefs of each day's work ran to 130 pages. Morgan presented a strategic overview, and 23 briefing papers were prepared, each one matching an agenda topic. The first day's presentation included one by the Movements Director of the War Office. From their point of view, the assault across the beach was a relatively straightforward affair. Their challenge would be planning the movement of troops to their embarkation sites, then loading men and equipment into craft, which would then, all of that would have to begin 2 weeks prior to D-Day. They would need 3 months' notice to be ready on time. Once the troops left their marshalling yards, they were committed to the operation as far as the directorate was concerned. Lee Mallory also presented on Monday discussing tactical air operations and warning that the Allies could not count on having total air superiority from the onset. At the end of the first day, Morgan and Mountbatten met to compare notes. Morgan was not encouraged. Mountbatten remained optimistic, but admitted that the debate had yet to be won. To Morgan, after observing what he called the opposition closely, it looked as if there was no hope. At some point on Tuesday, amid the presentations about the assault, starting with the pre-assault air and naval bombardment and finishing with advancing inland and building forces, the tide turned in Morgan's favor. Perhaps it was the Scottish setting, with the Scottish summer weather uncharacteristically warm and sunny for 4 consecutive days. Certainly the presentations were expert and detailed. Every voice was heard and discussions were intensely practical. The participants began to see how this operation could succeed. On Wednesday, Major General Brownjohn, COSSAC's logistics chief, presented on supply challenges related to the buildup of forces. The discussion centered on the familiar topic of the unlikely capture of a working port with sufficient capacity to be of use. It was at this point that the idea of the artificial harbors, the mulberry system, was put forth to the group. It was the innovation that made it possible for those studying what had been an intractable problem to believe that a solution had been found. And what I like about this photo is you can see outside and the difference being in the water, the calmness and active of the water outside the breakwater and inside. The other point was that Morgan made, he said, without the mulberries, without solving this problem, he would have had to recommend that the operation not go forward. The last period of the final day was set up as a free discussion time with topics being brought forward from the floor. Lieutenant General Gerald Bucknell of 30 Corps rose and suggested that the current approach of landing before dawn was not desirable. British doctrine favored a pre-dawn infantry landing that would punch a hole in the first line of defense. Then armor and self-propelled artillery would land in daylight to exploit the situation. The problem being that if the defense still held the beaches, then the follow-up landings became quite hazardous. Bucknell argued for a combined arms approach instead, as well as landing at dawn. Bucknell's remarks gained support from some of the senior officers there, including General Kenneth Anderson, freshly returned from commanding the British First Army in North Africa. Hughes Hallett noted that it would require them to figure out new ways to use existing landing craft, which in turn would require some amount of experimentation and a complete revision of the training program. There might just be enough time to train enough people by next May. He added that such a combined approach would only be successful in daylight, and based on his experience at Dieppe, it was feasible. Lee Mallory then took the floor and welcomed the idea of daylight landings with enthusiasm. At last, he said, the RAF could give effective close air support at the most critical point of the landing. He also agreed that with air superiority, a daylight landing was possible. General Paget also supported the idea with the proviso that the Navy could sort out the details. While the question of a daylight landing was not answered at Rattle, it provoked an ongoing discussion on that question, as well as the related one of increased shore bombardment. The decision, however, was left to the Supreme Commander. One of the great outcomes of Rattle was the creation of a comprehensive list of specific items to be addressed, each assigned to someone for action. It was distributed with the issue to be resolved shown on the left-hand side of the page, and those responsible for the resolution on the right-hand side directly opposite. General Paget, speaking at the end of the conference, said that while he still hoped an amphibious assault would not prove necessary, 21st Army Group would devote its attention to the problems that had been brought up at the conference. Morgan's old First Corps was directed to take on the work. By the end of the conference, there was general agreement that Normandy was the correct choice for the invasion. The participants could see a practical plan starting to take shape. COSSAC was recognized as the body responsible to the combined chiefs for the operation in question. The conference ended, quote, in a mutual exchange of public verbal bouquets, but more significant was the private remark by what had been a very senior pessimist. For the first time, I really believe in this operation. And while it didn't lead directly, that is Omaha on 6 June, and that's Lord Lovett's first Special Service Force getting ready to go ashore. For those who like numbers, COSSAC at its height totaled 1,100 people, 44% of the officers US. SHAEF, Eisenhower's headquarters just after the invasion, totaled almost 5,000, 63% of the officers US. And at the end of the war, Eisenhower's headquarters had grown to 14,000 people. Now, to be fair, he also was commanding 90 divisions and 2 tactical air forces at that point. One last very complicated chart. You have the Prime Minister and the President at the very top. In the center, combined chiefs of staff. the support staffs for the Americans on the left, comparable for the British on the right, leading down to the supreme commanders, the supreme allied commanders. And as you can see, there were 4: Supreme Commander Southwest Pacific Area, Supreme Commander Allied Expeditionary Force, Supreme Commander Mediterranean, and Supreme Commander Southeast Asia Command. Not all of which existed all of the time. They were created as necessary. And you can see under the Supreme Commander AEF how 1st U.S. Army Group, later renamed 12th U.S. Army Group, 21st Army Group, the Naval Expeditionary Force, and the Expeditionary Air Force. So there again, for those who need or enjoy org charts, is a visual representation of how the command and decision-making system worked. And that ends the presentation. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Steve. So let me actually have a question in the chat first, and well, sort of related to something I was thinking about listening to you, since I don't know if Jim or Ken told you, but one of the things we've been discussing for the last few months is Operation Sledgehammer. The plan to invade in 42.
Right.
Is one of our, well, he's not here today, but one of our regulars, Gary Giumarra, has done a lot of research on that and thinks it was a viable plan.
He's here.
So again, from Brandon in the chat, but also, so I guess one question is, what's the connection back to Sledgehammer with all the planning? What, if any, overlap is there in the staffs that wrote that plan and the planning here through the Overlord of COSSAC? So
broadly speaking, the 3 plans, or the 3 components, Bolero, Sledgehammer, and Roundup, were presented to General Marshall by the head of what was called the Ops Division, Operations Division, in the U.S. Army the U.S. Army Chief of Staff office. At the time, it was a brigadier general by the name of Eisenhower. And so he and his staff took issue with the picador strategy of the British, and felt that it was necessary to get over as quickly as possible and seek out, engage, and defeat the main German force in the West and drive towards the industrial heartland, the Ruhr. So there's a connection. Barker was one of the people that came over. At the time, his staff in 42 was 3 people. Those people who were part of ETUSA, ETO USA, the European Theater of Operations, U.S. Army, were deeply involved in all that planning. So many of them started in 42 and went through the COSSAC period, and some continued on into SHAEF headquarters. Some took on operational command. Some went other places. But there was, from a planning standpoint, a linkage there. And in addition, while Sledgehammer got canceled in July of 42, and Eisenhower considered it one of the darkest days of the war, some basic practical steps were taken as a result of making preparations for Roundup and Sledgehammer. So the ports in the southwest and southeast of England that had been closed out of the invasion scare in 40 were reopened. They started looking at where they could put HARDs and other places to embark troops. Some basic beginnings of organizing the logistics, all of the supplies that are going to have to get stockpiled, and where are we going to put the troops when they start coming over. So all of that started. So there was practical planning that occurred as a result of having, I don't know that you can even call them plans in the sense that, how detailed they were, but because the concept existed, practical matters started to be done. So without getting into the research to track names and stuff, they're because of ETO USA, which didn't exist back up, because of Bolero, because of Roundup, because of Sledgehammer, there was a theater command called ETO USA, even though there was no operational command that the American Army had. But because ETO USA existed, enough work could be done between 1942 and October of 43. So the US Army was ready to go across the channel in June of 44.
Go, Brandon. And then we'll go back to Joe.
Okay, yeah, it's just to follow up to what Steve was just saying. Just trying to triangulate between, Eisenhower's reaction to the cancellation of Sledgehammer and the constant, like you were talking about how they had to constantly say, we're looking for action here. We're not looking for planning. Was there a view, at least among the British, that the earlier things like Sledgehammer were strictly planning exercises, or that were just paper, sort of nobody was going to act on it?
It's an interesting question. There was certainly in 41, starting in 41, once it became reasonably clear that the British didn't have to spend a great deal of time worrying about fending off a German invasion. They started looking at what would it take to get across the channel. What they recognized they were going to have to re-enter the continent somehow. I think from my reading and my interpretation that they felt, looking at all the challenges, notwithstanding, and you have to remember the United States Army in 1942, from the British standpoint, wasn't the most impressive ally to have standing next to you. I mean, the Americans might have been able to bring a couple of fighter groups and a couple of divisions, one of which might be amphibious assault trained. Everything else is going to have to be pretty much borne by the British at that point. And there was no combat record for the American troops. Not that the British combat record was exemplary. So I think the British hoped that when they crossed the channel, it would be the penultimate act of the war, after Germany got to a position like it was in October of 1918, with unrest at home, a lack of morale, a collapse, and so that they could cross the channel without resistance. And I think that informed a lot of their attitude. It isn't that they said yes to round up knowing that they meant no. It's that they kept hoping that the combined bomber offensive, the action in Russia, that all of that would make an assault unnecessary. So they were continuing to go along, but at the same time hoping that they wouldn't have to fulfill their promise, or that a better set of circumstances would exist. Sledgehammer died basically so that Torch could live, I guess, to be melodramatic about it. And perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, Torch was arguably a better place for the United States Army to start its war against Germany. Like I said, that may be hindsight. But yeah, the British clearly had no enthusiasm for Sledgehammer. They made that obvious. And in the interest of coalition warfare and the way partners sometimes have to give up their dreams to keep peace in the family, the Americans went along with it. Also, Roosevelt and Churchill wanted North Africa. So,
thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's Mike unmute.
Okay, forgive any extant noise. I'm outside. I have a couple of questions, but I'll do them one at a time. Who else besides Eisenhower was considered to be supreme commander, if anybody else?
There was a lot of speculation. At one point, from where Morgan sat, Paget, as the nominal commander of 21st Army Group, could have been a candidate. Morgan actually went to Churchill and argued that Montgomery should replace Paget at 21st Army Group, not because there was particular animosity, but because he felt that the British were starting to get an attitude that we've done our bit, let the Americans carry the ball, and putting Montgomery in charge would underline the importance of the operation and bring a gravity or gravitas to it. But as a Supreme Allied Commander, the only other person who has ever been mentioned was, two, Alan Brooke, who was the head of the Imperial General Staff and the Army Chief of Staff for the British, and George Marshall. And Marshall was, there's a letter Roosevelt said in response to a letter he received from General Pershing, said that he wanted Marshall to be the Pershing of this war. And at one point they were thinking about creating a super European theater of operations that would combine the Mediterranean as well as Northwest Europe. And that increased scope would justify having someone of Marshall's stature become the Supreme Allied Commander. Ultimately, and even as early as October of 43, Roosevelt was changing his mind and saying he didn't want Marshall to leave Washington. He needed him, as the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And at that point, there really wasn't anyone else who could fit the bill. You weren't going to bring MacArthur across politically for FDR if for no other reason, given that the decision was made that it was going to be an American commander-in-chief or Supreme Allied Commander. Eisenhower was the only person who fit the bill. He'd already been doing that kind of job. He had experience with amphibious operations, working with the British in Torch, Sicily, Italy. He was a known quantity. The British felt they could handle him. So really, there wasn't a long list of candidates, let me put it that way. So Brooke, Marshall, Eisenhower.
Well, actually, the reason I heard that is there is a rumor that I heard when I was doing research in Canada, that as a compromise, before it was determined that it definitely had to be an American Supreme Commander, and they were thinking of a compromise, they were actually thinking about Andrew McNaughton. Now, I don't know. I thought maybe you might have some information about that.
No, I know that, as I indicated, that Morgan and McNaughton went back to Canadian Corps in the First War. Actually, as did Alan Brooke, who was head of artillery for the Canadian Corps. And so they were all known to each other. I had heard something along the way that there was some political ramifications about McNaughton maybe trying to keep the Canadian Army's independence a little too stridently, and there was a political motivation to send him back home. But I've not heard anything about considering McNaughton as a Supreme Allied Commander. Now, that interesting. I'd like to hear more about that.
So would I, actually. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right, let's just move on to Gary on mute. Gary? Can you mute there?
Yeah, sorry about that. Sorry. Somebody had just texted me right then. Okay, I also sorry for getting in late. So Alex was wrong. I was there, but I did tune in late. I'm the Sledgehammer Band, and I did read your book, which I got a lot out of.
Thank you.
So I'm glad you managed Paget for no other reason as in that I was never sure exactly how his name was pronounced because I've never heard anyone say it before. So about a year ago, I worked out that it probably was Paget. But in any event, going back to just picking up what you mentioned on the regard to the leadership in the Sledgehammer planning, the British way was to appoint 3 commanders. I'm not sure this was really the best way to do it. So for the ground forces, it was supposed to be Paget. He was designated the commander. For the air, it was Lee Mallory, which some of you people might know who he was. He eventually became head of fighter command and later was the Eisenhower's head of Air Force, I believe, or he was one of the principal commanders, the air commanders for Overlord. And then for the Navy, it was Ramsey, who was obviously the head for Overlord, is one of the top commanders of Overlord as well. So I appreciate your comment. I think one of the comments you just made in your response regarding the British intentions about Roundup is really an important point to make, and you do bring it up in your book, and I remember even which is basically, oh, we don't really want to do this until the Germans are basically on the point of defeat. I even suggest, or pick up on another historian suggested, that even the name Roundup is basically, inspired by that idea that basically they're beaten, their morale is collapsing, and or they're beaten on the Eastern Front, and we're just going to go round them up and drive into Germany, and then that attitude prevailed, in my opinion, at least until late 1943. So there always was this prejudice against any cross-channel invasion. Let's see. So I really do want to ask you a question. So you just there at the end of your presentation, you went over some of the discussion as to the assault and the tactics that might be used during the assault and everything. Which it's true. Up till Overlord, the idea had been to land with infantry before dawn. That was in the sledgehammer plan, and at dawn, the tanks would come in right afterwards, which I would argue is a perfectly viable approach until, and maybe even after, but at least until late 1940 or early 1944, when the entire approach of the German defenses completely changed with the arrival of Rommel and his idea of changing the defenses to water's edge defense, as opposed to something quite different, which again, I believe you brought up in your book as well. So I just think maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit. Up to that point, most places on the Channel Coast, on the French side of the Channel Coast, were very weakly defended, with a few exceptions like Dieppe. And when I say Dieppe, I mean right in front of Dieppe, not on either side of Dieppe, nowhere else, but a few exceptions like the port. So anyway, could you amplify on what your thoughts are with respect to, the planning had all been done and this presentation had been made, and yet in the meantime, months later, but before Overlord went down, there was a complete revolution in the German defensive approach.
Wow. So I will do my best to answer that question. I am not expert on German defenses, the Atlantic Wall. Clearly, they poured a lot of cement between late 41 or late 42 and 44, and they didn't realize the grossly ambitious plans that they had to do even more than they did. Clearly, and logically, they started with defending the Pas de Calais. Once they shifted over to a defensive positioning in June of 41, or leading up to June 41, with Barbarossa and the invasion of Russia, they were no longer looking for an offense across the channel, so they were starting to prepare. And the logical place to prepare your defense is where you think the enemy is most likely to attack, and that was the Pas de Calais. Both the German High Command and the British agreed, and Mountbatten and Morgan were the outliers in terms of that. And you're right, in 42, 43, Normandy coast was far less or less strongly or defended in terms of the redoubts, the machine gun emplacements, the poured concrete, the mines, the barriers, the barbed wire, all of that. There was, to backtrack a little bit, there was no one agreed method of amphibious assault. And so to differentiate, amphibious landing is basically an unopposed landing, ship to shore. An amphibious assault is when you force your way in against determined opposition. You kick the door in to stay. And as was noted in the book, the Marines developed a concept for the Pacific that was devoid of subtlety. Days, if not weeks, of massive preparation, bombardment, followed by overwhelming force in the frontal assault. That's how you take an island. That was war in the Central Pacific. Obviously, landing on a continental coast is a different problem. If you take that much time to prepare, then the enemy knows that's your attempted point of entry, so they start moving reinforcements and so forth. And not every piece of oceanfront is a acceptable landing point. So there's only so many. There's a finite number of places on a coastline where you can land, and where you can land in the kind of forces that we're talking about. Elements of what, 5 or 6 divisions going across the beach, plus 3 airborne divisions, plus specialist troops. So, and then supplying them. Another not answering your question directly, but another component was the idea of supplying across the beach. Morgan's plan was written in July of 43. That was the same time as Husky, the operation of Sicily, the invasion of Sicily. Wow, there's some feedback here. And that was the first time that all the elements of an amphibious operation, and the way we think of it, were on scene. It's the first time massive use of LSTs, of the specialist craft, that kind of coordination. So they were still feeling their way from the Allied side. The Germans, I think, had to reassess because of losses in the East, because of the way they had to reallocate forces. And they made decisions, based on what they could accomplish. You need to minimize your fixed forces, maximize your mobile forces. You have to make a judgment about where the enemy's going to land. They never did. The Germans never did come down definitely on one side or the other, so they were spreading their bets. But yeah, I think Rommel brought an energy. He brought his experience. It's that, if you look at the line at Alamein that he enforced, it's that kind of writ large, and with additional concrete cord. But yeah, the response is that the landings in the middle of the night or before dawn were problematic in some ways. Lack of naval gunfire support, finding the beach. If the infantry doesn't punch a hole, then everybody gets stacked up on the beach and it shows up at dawn. It was a reasonable change to the doctrine. It probably was accelerated by the recognition that the Germans were also going to be much more resolutely and stoutly defending the beaches than anything the Allies had encountered in the Mediterranean, and it was going to be a much tougher nut to crack, as they would say. So yeah.
Okay, Jim next.
All right, thank you, Steve. I just wanted to get your thoughts on another aspect of what Morgan is doing and his staff, and that is the whole question of deception. I think of many years ago, we had oh God, it must have been 20 years ago in New York, we had one of the people who actually was on the bodyguard staff. And of course, bodyguard is the term that's given to the deception operations after Cairo and Tehran conferences in 1943. But of course, this is going on beforehand. In fact, right from the period after the fall of France, because they begin deceiving the Germans as to the order of battle extends itself into North Africa, and they carry that from the North African campaign back to Europe. So I'm just wondering what kind of thoughts you have about that layering of this whole amazing planning process that Morgan is overseeing.
Um, so I'm trying to remember, and what I really want to do is reach behind me and grab a book called The Deceivers by Thaddeus Holt, which really covers that in great detail. Basically, because of Starkey, because of the requirement to launch one of these feints, and the history behind that goes back to Dieppe, where the British, the RAF in particular, thought that they won the air battle over Dieppe. In fact, they didn't, in the sense that they lost more aircraft than the Germans did. But they thought they had hit upon a way to try and lure the German fighters, day fighters, up in the air and defeat them, fight them on favorable terms, and attrite the German Air Force in that regard. It didn't work. But because of that, Morgan had to work with Johnny Bevan and the London Controlling Station, and Bevan was the person who really, still a lot of feedback, really organized and controlled the deception operations. And he and Morgan wrote a series of plans that evolved into Fortitude, North and South, and Bodyguard. The one that happened, that existed before that, I think goes to October, November of 43, was called Jael, Jael, and was involved in terms of the Overlord operation, was involved in creating the impression and talking points and giving information to the agents being controlled by the double cross system or the 20 committee, information that would suggest that the troops coming into Great Britain were mainly 8th Air Force, that was about the combined bomber offensive. It was people who were going to train, that and basically they were trying to sell what was going on in England as preparations for Operation Lincoln, for the once Germany collapsed. That's when they were coming across. And so that was where Morgan and Bevan got in terms of what the story was. A lot else of what happened, because one of the people, Bevan sent over a fellow by the name of Hesketh to be on the COSSAC staff. So there was some coordination that way. And there is where we see the beginning of the dummy message traffic, the fake unit buildup, all that sort of stuff. But it was a journey of education for Morgan. He had not had much experience, but it was so he went to school a little bit to learn about that. It was essential. It was a classic British way of war. I don't think the Americans normally think in that detail about deception planning, about wrong footing the enemy. And so it was something Morgan embraced, but it was something that came because he was tasked with a deception operation. And so he, from that, incorporated it into COSSAC planning, and the COSSAC story got incorporated into the deception planning that went forward with Agent Garbo and Agent Tricycle and all the rest of it.
Yeah, it was indeed Thaddeus Holt who was lecturing on that topic. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think Mike has another question, so Mike, unmute. And again, you guys can raise your hand if you want to ask a question.
Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. The question I have has to do with the allocation of the beachheads. I know you didn't quite get up to that, but how did they for instance, when it was decided that it was going to be British Americans and Canadians, how did they allocate the beachheads? What was the thinking that went behind that? And as to the divisions and the brigades that were actually assigned, was that up to the individual countries that were assigned those particular beachheads? But I was wondering what the thinking was between who would be landing at what beach when they finally decided on Normandy and decided where the landing sites would be.
So from Morgan's standpoint, and it's a map that I saw on the Imperial War Museum website that they wouldn't send me a GIF or a JPEG of because it's not good enough quality, but it's one of the studies that went into the plan, into the outline plan that was presented in Quebec, and it basically takes every beach from the Spanish coast around to Antwerp and says, here are the 8, 10, 12 possible sites. What is their capacity on a daily basis? And qualifies that. So, and obviously they did that for the Normandy area. The process, as I understand it, for Morgan, the outline plan, and again, one of the things that comes out of this, and it is pushing decision making down the chain. The combined chiefs of staff said, we have decided to conduct an operation, or is it feasible? Yes, it's feasible. Okay, we are going to conduct an operation. Now you tell us where in France. So Morgan and COSSAC came back and said Normandy, and said, okay. And we think we want this date. And so then a lot of that then got pushed down to the operational commands, 12th Army Group, US 12th Army Group, 21st Army Group, made a lot of the decisions about what was initially 3 beaches in front of, when Morgan presented his plan, there were 3 beaches. And they would have been Omaha, Sword and Gold. No, Sword and Juneau. Gold, I think, was the one in front of closest to Con, and that was added by Montgomery, as was Utah. So the Army groups then looked at beaches that they were assigned. They were given areas, 12th Army, Omaha is yours, 21st Army Group, these 2 beaches are yours, greater 3 beaches are yours. They then allocated units and worked out the detailed plan for the assault of those beaches. And then the assigned units, the divisions, corps and divisions, worked out the details. And so down to like a regimental level, looking at, okay, this is green 3 beach, and I'm landing 2 companies abreast, and this is how this is happening. So a lot of that decision making in terms of why the Canadians were at Juneau, or First Infantry was at Omaha. That's on Montgomery and Bradley, or the corps commander that was given that assignment. And that didn't come from Morgan.
But do you know what? And I know I'm going past Morgan at this point, but do you know what was, let's say, why Montgomery decided to make Juneau, which is right in the middle between Gold and Sword, the Canadian beachhead?
No, I don't. And I always thought it would have made more sense to have the Canadians land on the Americans' left. So you would have at least a North American language connection. Mark Milner has written a book about the Canadians at Juneau, so that might be a source that could where you could explore.
Well, I spoke to Mark, a while ago. I mean, we're just not clear if it was more of a political thing. For instance, maybe Montgomery wanted to make sure that he didn't have this kind of large North American force to the right. I have I have really no idea. Or it could have been simply because of the size, the capacities of the divisions, and what they were trained for. So,
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I think if I remember right, the Canadian division was more heavily anti-armor, and I think that was probably perhaps a divisional commander decision. But given the task that there was envisioned for the Canadians, that maybe they were more suited. And then you have to look at not just the beach, but what was the 10, 12, 15 miles in front of them once they get off the beach.
All right, then, Joe, you have to move yourself, Joe.
So I think there's some of that. It's it's not just hitting the beach, but what do you do the first week or whatever, anticipating what the German moves would be. Montgomery was pretty good about anticipating how the Germans would respond. So it could have been that given the nature of Third Division, the Canadians, that's why they were there. That was, the terrain suited the mission they were assigned. But that's speculation on my part.
well, it was informed speculation.
I think I saw Frank had a question. Frank, you want to ask it? Unmute.
Yeah, this is regarding the tragedy that you sort of mentioned, that Roosevelt refused to put Marshall as the El Supremo of the Supremos because of, apparently, from your opinion, political reasons and others. Quite clearly, it would have been preferable for there to be Dragoon as well as Normandy Overlord going on simultaneously, and that was feasible had there been a single commander and over all theatres. Instead of 4 separate supreme commanders, you could have, if need be, I mean, it was supposed to be Germany first, you could have theoretically done both at the same time. And that would require the allocation of resources and the deprivation of resources from one supreme command to another. It's a misnomer to say supreme anyway, because there were 4 of them.
Well, right. Right.
So I'm just saying that if you're going to overwhelm the German capabilities, to defend, you need to do it possibly 3. And if, from what I'm getting at, from what you're saying, it's the limitation may have been actually the size of the staff itself. And, if there's a lesson from this going forward, I mean, we're talking about potentially problems in the Pacific and in the Atlantic area with NATO. This is a lesson, and it's a valuable lesson. If there is to be the proper decision making such that there is a priority versus, in this case, based on your organizational chart, each supreme commander, that was untouchable. What he was given, that you couldn't divert it anywhere else. Although we know there are a couple of examples, like aircraft carriers going from one area to another, but essentially that's their private bailiwick. You don't touch that. And as you pointed out, the Marines, the way they do things, nobody invited Marines to discuss COSSAC, obviously, and they had assets and they had potential to do all sorts of things in their own right that would have been possibly useful. So if you want to discuss that, if it's worth discussing.
Well, it's an interesting topic. The Second World War obviously was a global war, hence the name. And the war was being fought on many fronts at the same time. As you said, there were 4 at least 4 major areas of interest that were engaged in combat. And there was a commitment, even though there was initially a commitment to stay on the strategic defensive in the Pacific while Germany came first. Whether you want to lay it at Admiral King's feet or the political need for to respond to the demands of the American people for vengeance or revenge after Pearl Harbor, or just the fact that the United States had to take action in the Pacific to stop Japanese expansion there, because the first 6 months of 1942, the crisis for the United States was Japan, not Europe. And then that develops a logic of its own. Once you have troops in theater, there's a logic to a next step, a next battle, and so forth. So there are political components. There are Morgan, in a very different context, said there's so much more to war than fighting battles. It isn't always a pure military consideration that wins the day. There are also some practical matters. If you have LSTs in the Pacific, they're probably not going to get shuttled over to the Mediterranean. You can shuttle between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, but just the length of time moving relatively slow moving vessels like an LST or an LPD, that many thousands of sea miles, that's a one-time movement. They're not going back where they came from. So once ships were in the Pacific, they were pretty much going to stay in the Pacific. Once they were in the Atlantic, they were going to stay within those boundaries. So you're right. It could resources have been allocated differently? Yes. Would that have that would have required a different political dynamic? Would it have been facilitated if Marshall had been controlling a sort of a super European theater? Possibly, but then you're in a coalition, and British national security interests, British diplomatic interests, the urgency of empire, of Suez Canal, etc., was fundamentally in conflict with some fundamental United States national security interests. And all of those things get jumbled up into a pot, and somebody has to make, in my view, what ends up being the least imperfect decision to keep everything going forward. So I think they did a good job. Certainly they wanted to have Overlord and Dragoon at the same time, the invasion of south of France. That proved not feasible in the end. Dragoon was necessary. The landing in Normandy made it easier for Dragoon, and Dragoon was essential to the success. So having it happen 6 weeks later, or whatever it was did that change the outcome of the war dramatically? I don't know. I don't think so, but I don't know. But yeah, interesting question without final resolution, I think, would be the way to put that.
All right, so let's try and get Joe, see if he can unmute, and we don't have too much ambient noise from his side. So Joe, can you unmute and ask your question?
Yes, I just want to say thank you to the speaker. I happen to be out in the street right now, so it's going to be muffled. But in your opinion, what was the most important decision made about the invasion?
Wow. Well, to be honest, I think the most important decision was to do it. What I mentioned in my book, and it would be another 40 minutes, 30 minutes, is that in October of 43, it's being brooded about that Marshall could be the Supreme Allied Commander, and Morgan could be his chief of staff. So at Barker's suggestion, Marshall invites Morgan to Washington for what he thinks is 5 days. It ends up being 5 weeks. And he sits at Marshall's side the whole time. And Morgan really sees the world and sees the war in the same way that Marshall and the Americans do. They get along great. At the end of that, the chiefs of staff are getting ready to go to Tehran, go to Cairo and Tehran. And Marshall says there's a real possibility, because of something they picked up at the foreign ministers conference that ended at the end of October in Moscow, that the Soviets might press for more action sooner in the Mediterranean just to relieve the pressure. That we may not, that the British and the Russians may unite in demanding action. And in that case, the needs of coalition warfare will mean that we'll just have to postpone Overlord, and that's just going to be the way it is. So Marshall was saying the coalition is more important than any one battle or any one operation, and that we just have to accept that's a real possibility. And then they go to Tehran, the famous conference meeting with Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt. The only plan that makes sense is Overlord and Dragoon, called Anvil at the time. Who's in command? There isn't one. Well, then nothing's going to happen until you get a commander. 3 days later, Eisenhower's appointed the Supreme Allied Commander. But at that point, Churchill, albeit perhaps grudgingly, says, Overlord's going forward. And even though there may be some small rear guard actions, particularly concerning Dragoon, there is at the highest political level support for the operation, and it goes forward. And I think that the fact that two countries with very different outlooks who are allied with each other found enough common ground to launch that operation is probably the single most important decision. Another aspect is that the American Joint Chiefs of Staff tended to incline to risk taking. Guadalcanal, Operation Watchtower, was a throw of the dice. Torch was, in the opinion of Tom Handy, who was the general in charge of the ops division at the time, a high-risk operation, both of which changed the course of the war. Arguably, the way Nimitz fought Midway was a gamble, or at least a calculated risk. There seems to be a stream of those kinds of decisions that you cannot find when you look at the approach the British Chief of Staff took, which is much more conservative, much more let's, if not play it safe, let's avoid losing. Let's not gamble quite so much. And that could be resource-based as well as experience-based once you go through what they went through in 1939, 40, 41. So you have someone who is a risk taker, someone who's not a risk taker. They are metaphorically married, and they go along with taking the risk because Normandy was the risk. So I think, again, that ability to work together to find the ground somewhere in the middle where neither side digs in their heels and says, I'm just going to go to the Pacific and deal with that if you don't agree with me, although there was some of that. I think that is probably the overarching lesson from looking at Overlord. That and preparation. Jesus, they studied everything. There was the degree of detail in their planning is phenomenal, just phenomenal.
Yes, to kind of to piggyback on that, we've had Nigel Hamilton come to talk to us about each of his books on FDR and World War II. And so I just wonder if you agree with his characterization of the FDR-Churchill relationship, and also, well, one specific question. Nigel argues that FDR had to strong-arm Churchill by basically threatening to deny the Brits access to the Manhattan Project to get them to cave on Overlord. So, did you find that to be true?
the two alloys and all that. I don't know. I haven't read his books, so
Okay.
I don't know. I have not come across that in my other readings, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means the books I read didn't talk about that particular aspect of it. There were certainly strong words exchanged and a full and frank exchange of ideas, as the State Department would say. And there's certainly other lines drawn saying that if Dragoon didn't go forward, then we're not bringing anything into the Mediterranean for other operations. It's going to be Dragoon and nothing. So there certainly was some evidence of that at some level. Whether that extended all the way to the Manhattan Project, I don't know. Yeah, so I think that my most direct answer is I don't know.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I don't think James hasn't. Let's go to James since he hasn't asked a question yet. So James McFadden, unmute and ask Steve your question.
Yeah, first of all, I got in late. I apologize, but there's an aspect of this I've wondered about a long time, and how much politics played in delaying the invasion in the hopes that the Nazis would basically destroy the Soviet Union and get rid of this future problem, because there was a lot of fear about the Soviet Union, prior to World War II, and so let them battle it out and destroy each other, and then we'll go in. And so delay for that reason. And then when the Soviet Union finally turned around and started, and the Nazis started to pull back, it seemed like that's when the invasion of the mainland happened. And I'm just, I've kind of wondered about it, but I've never heard anybody speak on it. I wonder if you can say something.
Sure. Again, not right down the middle of things I'm an expert at, but a couple of points. As Morgan developed Operation Rankin, the plans for what we would do if Germany collapsed, it became for the Americans, and Mark Stoller addressed this in at least one of his books, a way to think about post-war Europe and the need to meet the Soviets as far east in Western Europe as possible. That Western Europe, under the domination of the Soviet Union, even if you were ashore, wasn't really defensible unless you had an American presence, and that presence was at least on the Rhine, if not east of the Rhine. And that goes back to Mackinder and his doctrine of Eurasia as the center of power. So with Rankin as kind of a stick or a motivator, the Americans wanted to get across as early as was feasible and practical to pull off an operation that they believed would be successful. So they were pushing for that. I think the British, there is some evidence before the war, there was at least one British intelligence paper written that said, why don't we just let Nazi Germany go east? They'll tackle the Soviet Union, one of them will go down, and our job will be a lot simpler. We shouldn't get involved in a war in Eastern Europe in between those two. So there's some whiff of that, but I think there is also the fact that even if you factor in the British Empire, British forces were stretched thinly and without the resources that the United States brought to bear, and with the importance of the Mediterranean, the overarching importance of the Mediterranean to the British, they were going to be disinclined to go across the channel until they had some reason to believe it was really going to work. And I think they went across, and operationally they were ready and all of that. So I'm talking at the political level, at the chiefs of staff, and at the ministers level. They went ahead with it maybe before they were 100% convinced it was going to work. So whether there was an intentional delay, I can't say. I think if you look at all the different factors and all the fighting that was going around, all the different theaters, without, as one of the previous questions, without a massive reallocation of resources in 43, it probably wouldn't have happened any faster than the invasion wouldn't have happened any faster than it did.
There's an aspect of this that maybe you could just quickly comment on, because I think it's related. And somewhere I've had some discussion with somebody who said that basically the pact that Soviet Union made with Hitler, you know, in 38, 39, was basically done to force the rest of Europe, because Stalin realized that the Nazis were going to come from. They realized that they were this great resource that they could colonize, and they'd be on their own if because that was the direction Hitler went. So by doing that, it basically forced the rest of Europe to declare war on Hitler and brought them into the war, and gave the Soviet Union time to arm up, you know, in preparation, because they knew that was going to happen, and spent much of the time preparing Ukraine and this whole area on the way, on the march that the Nazis were going to eventually do toward Moscow. And that gave them time to actually prepare for this war that they knew was coming.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. I mean, if you look at, again, British foreign policy in 35, 36 regarding Abyssinia, now Ethiopia, if you look at the British attitude about Spain, about the Rhineland, about Czechoslovakia in 38, what assurances could the British and the French give Stalin that he would feel were believable or creditable? So what's his option? If he's read Hitler's book, it's very clear that Hitler has always talked about expansion to the east, driving towards the Urals. That's the natural German empire. He wants the Ukraine. Yeah, I mean, just realpolitik would make an agreement between Hitler and Stalin a logical step. And I think they're both cynical enough to realize that it wasn't a permanent relationship. And obviously there's other factors, because, you know, at the same time you say that, Stalin had been purging the officer corps and doing other things in terms of reworking the organization of the army. So, but yeah, I think that, you know, was the pact between Stalin and Hitler a cynical ploy to buy time? Yeah, probably. You could call it that. That's a good description as anything else, because I know I did buy time and also bought territory in a sphere of influence.
Okay, Jim.
Yeah, thank you, James, for that. One thing it raises, Steve, is the whole question of how we view the interrelationship of their planning with the vagaries of the Eastern Front and how that's proceeding. And also, you know, it gets into questions of, you know, issues of the Cold War, because obviously what you were talking about, if there are ideas to get into Europe as fast as possible and get as far east as possible, that's something I hadn't thought of when you see the arguments made in 42 by Marshall to land and invade, which get usurped towards the spring and summer of 1942. But really interesting was what you said about the risk-taking issue earlier, about how the Americans were more prone to risk-taking as opposed to the British being more conservative. And you sort of see that argued out in, you know, we had here long ago, I think you might have participated when, well, Joe Strange never really talked about his dissertation, but that was one of the thrusts of the articles he wrote many years ago about how the British were afraid that they would basically be repelled quickly if they engaged in direct combat with the Germans. Now, I want to get your sense of how they're integrating the issue of follow-on forces, how to build up the bridgehead and beachhead, how to actually get enough force in there to sustain itself against a serious counterattack by the Germans. Because, that's one of the things that when you look at the sort of straight narrative historiography, because I talked to Nigel Hamilton many years ago when after he had done his biographies of Montgomery. And what I was struck with was when Nigel, I said, it's sort of interesting. Monty comes in and he basically seizes command of let's expand the beaches to land in. And part of his argument is precisely this, that the German panzer strength had gotten to a point where he had to take it very seriously that they could counterattack quickly and throw them back into sea. So I'm wondering how Morgan, in your look at him, sort of deals with that question, of the German dispositions, their ability to counterattack. I know Gary in his work on Sledgehammer basically argues that they just didn't have enough strength, period, to defend themselves, to actually throw us into the sea, but then they could have built it up. So I'm just wondering that question of buildup, and he was a former Marine officer, and this is always the big issue. How do you basically build up a beachhead and then exploit it? I'm just curious what you think.
Yeah. So, and my time with you guys is winding down because I haven't had dinner yet, and it's 9:00, and even in France, that's pressing it. So I apologize for that. The build-up question, a couple of points. From Morgan's standpoint in 1943, it was a build-up race. How fast can we put units, combat-ready units, ashore with the logistical support they need to fight at a rate faster than the Germans can reinforce? And the idea there was to push out to get a lodgment, to get a large enough space so that you had some room to maneuver, and you could trade space for time and still have units behind you building up and logistical support supplies being built up, and take advantage of the blocage to what he called defensive offensive operations. So from the standpoint of 1943, he was envisioning getting a pushing inland and then concentrically, expanding that area and then turning towards Cherbourg because he didn't have enough force to land at what became Utah Beach. And people who landed at Utah, of course, had as their task to seize Cherbourg as quickly as possible. So that's one aspect. Another interesting aspect is what's the mix. I mentioned that the Canadians heavied up their anti-armor weaponry because they anticipated they were going to bear the brunt of at least some of the German armored counterattacks. There were independent tank brigades that the British put in. The Americans were slow putting armored units in, but the terrain in front of them was different. So, but yeah, that's what you look at is, can I build up my forces faster than the other guy can reinforce his forces? Remember, Morgan had a set of criteria, one of which was command of the air, and the other was, and I'm going to get the numbers wrong, not more than 5 divisions that could reinforce the area within the landing area within 3 days of D-Day. So the calculation was that we were going to give ourselves the best chance to get deep enough to prepare defensive positions and to get reinforcements ashore. But it was a calculation. It was as I said in the book, it wasn't as if they had some sort of algorithm that they could crank out the other end after putting in all the factors. It was a judgment based on their experience and what their intelligence told them. So the quality of intelligence plays into that as well.
Okay, let's maybe take a last question from Gary then, if you have to go, Steve.
I do apologize.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
Okay, we kept you long enough. Yeah, so Gary.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, I just want to comment on the discussion before about the possibility of Amble Dragoon going in sooner, and circumstances. And I think it really goes to the question, and I don't really think it's the responsibility of Steve in this context to do it, but I think the whole idea in my mind that there's this reticence to really criticize in any really fundamental way Allied leadership. Yes, there's problems here and there, but to really come down and look at the conduct of the war and the strategy of the war in a real more comprehensive and to bring out problematic aspects of it. And I brought up one of them, but I want to bring up another one, and that is, and again, is something that Steve did allude to, which is basically once resources went to the Pacific, that was a one-way trip. There was no sharing back. That to me is a really fundamental flaw. You have to understand that at the beginning of 1944, the planning was for the Marianas operation to go forward not until November of 1944. And when they found out they could move it up, it moved up to June. So the resources were there. They were stuck in the Pacific. So instead of moving it up to June, why not July or late July or early August and get the most important thing? Everyone agrees that the most important thing is supposed to be the invasion of Western Europe and the defeat of Nazi Germany. Okay, there's that in itself is not a dispute. So why not bring all your resources together to give them? And of course, we don't know what would have happened if they invaded earlier, but I would say, logically speaking, it obviously gives them a better chance to finish things earlier, to do the simultaneous invasion. So, and it also comes back to where were the big battleships? There's been some, Williamson Murray and others have criticized the lack of firepower at Utah Beach. Well, because the big battleships, they were older battleships, but they still had big guns on them, just as big as the latest U.S. battleships. We're again in the Marianas, not at Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, which had the oldest 12-inch gun ancient battleship that fired for 15 or 20 minutes, when you had probably 70 or 80 12-inch guns compared to 70 or 80 14 and 16-inch guns sitting out there in bombarding Saipan a couple weeks later. Well, that just doesn't make any sense. So I'm sorry that wasn't really a question, but that's my little comment. I would like to comment on a few other things, but I'm going to cut myself short now. So,
well, thank you. And my own comments back would involve Admiral King, not to be overlooked, and the dynamics of organizational politics within the United States military, as well as setting priorities, and how do you keep competing priorities happy, or the people who have competing priorities happy. I think it's very important that
King is president, not commander in chief. That's my point. That there should be extreme criticism of King's approach, and that should affect the whole discussion. And instead, we talk about, well, this commander Brooke didn't want to do this, and good. Well, I'm sorry, they're not in charge. And their opinions are not, they're not holy writ.
That's true. I guess where I agree is it's very hard, even at some distance, to sustain criticism of the generals and the admirals who won the war. Even Eisenhower's, periodically people will criticize Eisenhower's choices, the broad front strategy. Why didn't they go into across the Rhine in the South earlier? Why did they not give Patton the gasoline that he needed, as opposed to Montgomery? And I don't have an answer to that. I think it's important to separate myth from what the data shows. And World War II and World War II for the United States is laden with mythology, national myth, and prying that loose, particularly for popular history as opposed to academic history, is a remarkable challenge. And I don't have a clue as to how to address that, except, you know, book by book, inch by inch, and to keep asking the questions guys like you ask, because, you know, that's why people go back and look at things that you think are settled. So.
Right. So I guess we should thank you, Steve, for giving us so much of your time.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it a lot, and I appreciate it. I've enjoyed the couple other sessions I've snuck in on, and I'll continue to check in from time to time whenever something sounds interesting, and I've got a spare couple hours. So this is great.
Yeah.
Steve, you're in France. You by any chance in Normandy?
Actually, I'm in Angers, which is down toward Nantes and the Loire Valley. So.
Oh, lucky you. Lucky
you is right.
All right. So let's just thank Ken Aaron for engineering all this. But Jim,
thank you very much.
Tell everybody about our upcoming talks. Since I don't remember.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Steve for coming. Thank you so much. I apologize for being late. You know, the effects of radiation get you. Anyway, and next week we're going to have Paul Kennedy from Yale coming to talk about his book Victory at Sea. And as I said to Ken, I said to actually Ted Cook today, I'm dying to play the first 2 minutes of Richard Rogers' documentary Victory at Sea.
Gotta do it.
We can introduce them.
Yeah.
But Steve, it was really great to hear you talk, and yeah, it's a great subject, and you know, there's all these questions. I wish we could have had you eat beforehand so we could sit there and subject you to more interrogation for another hour. But we'll have to do that another time, because the people always forget how D-Day, you know, the popular conception of it's Pearl Harbor, D-Day, and Hiroshima, and that's it. Right. In the public's eyes, and then all this preparation, all the things you were saying, and then the questions coming in from people just make it even more fascinating, because it raises many other questions. And we'll have to have you come in again soon to maybe talk about the whole arguments we've been having with Gary over Sledgehammer.
That'd be great. Look forward to it.
Yeah, but anyway, thank you so much. It was a great pleasure to have you here.
Great. See you. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Great. Thanks.
Bye.